Good morning, everyone. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let me try that again. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
All right, let's lift up our hearts. Let's say good morning. I want to welcome you all to this wonderful 2025 Paul Galloway Lecture. This is a lecture in social justice brought to you by Fourth Presbyterian Church of Chicago, and it's been graciously sponsored by Maggie Galloway, the wife of Paul, and this is in honor of Paul, who served as a veteran Chicago journalist and was a tireless advocate, along with Maggie, for social justice. And Maggie, I just want to say a quick thank you for your sponsorship of this lecture and for your graciousness in being able to lift up important voices for justice in these crucial, weighty, and important times. So I've got a little gift for you, Maggie. Got some flowers because you're welcome. I know, and our friend and co-conspirator Regan as well deserves those flowers with you too. I like to call, they are like sisters, and I like to call Regan our prophetic scout because Regan is always scouting out some prophetic task, role, or voice that we can lift up. And usually anywhere that Regan goes and scouts something out, there is gold there. And so glad to follow in your lead. But Maggie, again, we are grateful for your partnership in our capacity to lift up important voices in this time. So the voice that we want to lift up today in 2025 is that of Reverend Jermaine Ross-Allam. He is the inaugural director of the Center for the Repair of Historical Harms for our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA. He's also a PhD candidate, so we're just going to call him Doctor, okay? He's a PhD candidate in social ethics at the historic Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He's completing a book that's tentatively titled, want to make sure this title is still there, Jermaine, Trammeled by the Bonds of Union, The Social Ecology of Extralegal Violence and Impunity Against Afro-Americans from the New York City Draft Riots in 1863, in the midst of the American Civil War, and to the Wilmington, North Carolina coup d'etat in 1898. So spanning some very important decades in American history. He also volunteers with Restorative Justice Actions, with Restorative Actions and Economic Equity, an initiative born from the intersection of theology, justice, and economics. He has served as a parish associate and interim parish associate pastor at 2 Presbyterian churches. He has been based for many years in Minnesota and Minneapolis. He received his master's in divinity from United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. During his time in Minnesota, he also served on Governor Dayton's Commission on Judicial Selection, where he worked for equity and fairness in Minnesota's judiciary. He also graduated from Southwestern Adventist University, where he received a bachelor's in journalism. And so thinking about the Galloway heritage and legacy, I think it's fitting that a journalist speaks to us today. Before I welcome Jermaine up, I just want to say how grateful I am for all of you who are gathering with us, both in person as well as online for today's lecture. It's going to be recorded so that this becomes a resource for our congregational community, but also for Presbyterians and the public at large. Because as you all know, these are important and challenging times that we live in. We see a lot of fraying in the social fabric and the destruction of many of the social covenants that we have lived by, both in this society and in other societies during our time. It is an age of reactionary politics and sometimes reactionary theologies and ideologies, and it is a time and a place in which the church is charged to speak. The church is charged to find its voice. And we're called to be healers in our community, healers in our society and around the globe. But in order to do that, sometimes we need to look back. And the Christian faith is particularly adept at this. We have the audacity to believe that stories that are 2,000 plus years old have relevance for our life today. And so if those 2,000-year-old stories have relevance for us today, then surely events and stories that have taken place in the last 50 years, 100 years, 200, 500 years also have important value for us today. So I look forward to Reverend Jermaine's talk so that he can help us to be healers who look to the past and bring medicine for the present and for the future. Welcome.
Thought I was going to have a small catastrophe. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Reverend Joe, for that generous introduction and for the invitation to be here with all of you today. It is humbling to have the honor to address you at this wonderful occasion. And I also want to say thank you to Deacon Margie for being so helpful and being so hospitable and making this an occasion and a location that I was excited and continue to be excited to return to today. Thank you very much. So I will speak for about 45 minutes, and I'm hoping to leave a generous amount of time for us to have conversation and interaction. As you heard earlier, my name is Jermaine Ross-Allam, and I am the inaugural director of this denomination's Center for the Repair of Historic Harms, where our mission is growing the number of human beings working to share the good news that repair and reparations make common sense for the common good as soon as possible and for as long as it takes. If we had more time, I would talk to you in depth about this mission of ours, because every word is a separate mission or work plan of its own. But I'll emphasize as we begin that when we say as soon as possible, we intend to communicate that there is absolutely no reason to drag our feet in the work of reparative justice. This is work that is long overdue, and it is always the right time to do the wrong thing, no matter who is in the White House or in any other place of power. But we also emphasize as long as it takes, because we also realize that if you are going to do the right thing after having gone a long time not doing the right thing, then it is better to do the right thing for as long as it takes, rather than simply engage in half measures so that you can very quickly proceed as if you have done something useful. So in this talk, I'll engage a wide variety of things. We will certainly deal with theology and our scriptural tradition to remind ourselves what is possible, because the love of God through the Holy Spirit has been poured out into our hearts. We will take a look at the historical narrative to look at places in our national narrative and perhaps our own theological thinking that has gotten us in the way of recognizing mistakes early enough to prevent them from being so large that we kid ourselves into thinking that they are impossible to deal with decisively. I'll also talk to you about some of the work that the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms is engaged in, so that you can understand that when we talk about the ministry of repair, we are talking not about the things that should be done only, but that we are actually talking about the things that are being done right now, so that hopefully you will be inspired to ask, how can I become a part of that work? And I will be very glad that you asked, and I will have some suggestions for you. And we'll conclude our conversation by taking a look at a particular part of our Confession of 1967. And we'll remind ourselves of what we said as a denomination many decades ago, well, not so many decades ago, as it concerns reconciliation in society. First, I would like to begin with one of my very favorite thought partners who always gives me something to agree with and something to lament. And I'm sure perhaps you feel the same. That is the Apostle Paul. In Paul's letter to the house churches in Rome, in chapter 12, verses 1 through 2 in particular, the apostle has the following to say: I urge you, therefore, brothers and sisters, through the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a sacrifice, living, holy, and acceptable to God, your reasonable worship. Rational worship in some translations. Also, do not be conformed to this eon, but be transformed by the renewal of the mind, that you may ascertain what the will of God is, the good and acceptable, and one of my new favorite words, perfect. We won't get deeply into an exegesis of this text, but this text nevertheless raises some interesting questions and observations as we think about the ministry of repair in the context of the United States of America. I'm struck by this text more recently than ever before, that the apostle urges that in view of God's mercies, we, and that is both individual and collective as a body of Christ, present our bodies, not other people's bodies. And in just a few minutes, I'll try to go back to the political, economic work of a specific person in the 19th century that I think will help us understand what it might mean and have meant for those of us in the United States as a heritage to have engaged in human sacrifice on a geopolitical scale and in terms of domestic politics as well. The apostle also says that in view of God's mercies, we must refuse to be conformed to the structure of thought, or the ruling ideology, if you will, of this eon, which is a long period of time. And that long period of time, if this were a New Testament class, which it is not, would cause us to ask some really interesting questions about what is Paul talking about spiritually and theologically by the word eon. But on a small scale, we can say that Paul is telling believers not to be conformed to the status quo of that day and age, particularly certain patterns of thought and behavior that come from Roman exceptionalism and Roman imperial ideology, the Pax Romana, etc. I'm sure this probably rings a bell. In our own context, however, we might think of the ideology that rules the day in the United States of America and beyond as racial capitalism. That is not the full story of what is and has been going on in our context, but it gives us some indication of what we may need to focus on as Christians when it comes to repair. Paul also says that we are to be renewed, or rather transformed, by the renewal of the mind. And that is a transformation of the body politic by reschematizing our collective understanding of reality together. And there are a lot of different ways of understanding this word mind that we translate into English, which in the Greek is nous, which is a broad term that ranges from a reference to a mental state or reasoning ability of characters in a drama, perhaps by, who knows, Hesiod, or I can never remember this gentleman's name when I want to say it. Homer, of course, the great Greek poet, who could forget Homer. But nous also refers to a governing principle or a law that organizes the cosmos. So we may think of terms like the Logos, which we see in the beautiful prologue to the Gospel of John. Nous also refers to the rational part of the soul that is capable of abstract thought and reasoning, and it is also understood in its ancient context as a divine intellect that orders the cosmos again. So this text from Paul, which is very user-friendly on the surface, is actually reminding us that God expects that we take advantage of the power of the Holy Spirit to transform ourselves collectively through the renewal of our mind as a very important part, among other things, of worship. Now, when I think of what is difficult and what presents us with numerous challenges in the United States when we talk about reparative justice and reparations, I must think about not the people who give us the impression that reparation can never happen because of racism's most obvious, perhaps right-wing face. But when we talk about reparative justice in the context of the United States and around the world, as it concerns people of African descent and other people around the world, we have to pay attention critically to what excuses are offered to us for doing nothing quite yet. And in a podcast with Bruce Springsteen, because who else would you talk about this with? Former President Barack Hussein Obama sat down for a podcast called Renegade. I don't know if you've heard of Renegade. I don't think it has continued. I don't necessarily recommend it except perhaps for historical reasons. But in one of the first couple episodes of that podcast, Bruce Springsteen asked former President Obama, why, since you acknowledge the reality of systemic racism, did you not promote reparations during your presidency? Which is a great question, and I thank the All-American Rocker for raising this important point. And in a few different words and in a few different ways, Obama said that it was the politics of white resistance and resentment, the talk of welfare queens and the undeserving poor, that made reparations not only a non-starter, but potentially counterproductive in his presidency. Now, this is a case that justifies us remembering the distinction between truth with a capital T and the recitation of mere facts. I will concede, along with the former president, that in the current moment there are reasons for why people do not feel inclined to say yes to reparative justice and reparations in earnest. But we are reminded, of course, as Christians, that simply because something goes against the grain of public opinion does not mean that we are not called to do what it takes to get the right thing done and to send a signal to the rest of the world as a witness that doing the right thing is always right. More on that later. When I think about the posture of the first half-white president of the United States on the question of reparations, it makes me ask the question, how did we get here? How do we get to a place where that which is obviously right, necessary, and possible seems as if it is so difficult to do that it might destroy the entire country should we pursue it in earnest? And when we have questions like this about the United States of America, I very rarely find anyone better to turn to for some clarity than W.E.B. Du Bois. And in his very first book, which is the publishable version of his dissertation, which I myself look very forward to finishing myself, we have very important warnings from W.E.B. Du Bois. In the book, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America, 1638 through 1870, Du Bois has the following to say in the final chapter of that book. Had the country been conceived of as existing primarily for the benefit of its actual inhabitants, it might have waited for natural increase or immigration to supply the needed hands. But both Europe and the earlier colonists themselves regarded this land as existing chiefly for the benefit of Europe and as designed to be exploited as rapidly and ruthlessly as possible. I'm losing my place, pardon me here. Designed to be exploited as rapidly and ruthlessly as possible of the boundless wealth of its resources. This was the primary excuse for the rise of the African slave trade to America. Every experiment of such a kind, however, where the moral standard of a people is lowered for the sake of a material advantage, is dangerous in just such proportion as that advantage is great. In this case, it was great. No American can study the connection of slavery with United States history and not devoutly pray that their country may never have a similar social problem to solve until it shows more capacity for such work than it has shown in the past. There never was a time in the history of America when the system had a slighter economic, political, and moral justification than in 1787. This is the year of the Constitutional Convention. And yet, with this real, existent, growing evil before their eyes, a bargain, largely of dollars and cents, was allowed to open the highway that led straight to the Civil War. The most obvious question, which this study suggests, is how far in a state can a recognized moral wrong safely be compromised? And although this chapter of history can give us no definite answer suited to the ever-varying aspects of political life, yet it would seem to warn any careless nation from allowing, through carelessness and moral cowardice, any social evil to grow. No persons would have seen the Civil War with more surprise and horror than the revolutionists of 1776. Yet, from the small and apparently dying institution of their day arose the walled and castled slave power. From this, we may conclude that it behooves nations as well as human beings to do things at the very moment when they ought to be done. These words were written, or at least finally published, in 1896. So today, we don't have time to talk about all of the issues facing the United States that require brave and decisive action right now. But I'll just say, so that we can be simultaneously aware of multiple things, that we do face a rising tide of poverty that is unnecessary in this nation, that is the result of human choice across ethnic groups, that requires intelligent repair. We are facing an unprecedented assault on our civil liberties that many people unfortunately think is only for undocumented immigrants with criminal records in this moment. But if time permits, we will uncover some information that should give us pause and help us to realize that those of us who believe we are not next in line for what is happening to the most vulnerable are most certainly in line for a rude awakening if we do not change course very, very soon. And we don't have time to discuss, but should at least name, that we are currently in the midst of a bipartisan obsession with pretending that our nation is not currently funding not only an apartheid state, but an ongoing live-streamed genocide. That and many other things concern us today that we don't have the time to engage deeply in this talk. Worshiping God in Christ as our Creator demands that we endure the risk that accompanies doing our part to repair and co-create our shared world. We do this by many means, including decolonizing structures and relationships, repairing the damage done, creating and instituting non-repetition guarantees, and establishing repair and reparations as a routine function and theological process. Now, when we talk about repair and reparation as a theological process, what we are acknowledging is that in the history of European colonization of many lands, including Christians and Presbyterian involvement in that colonization, we have not only damaged folks in terms of ecology and economics, but we have also damaged entire cosmologies and erased them from the planet so that future generations have to do extraordinary things just to be able to get a trace of what their ancestral traditions might have been. And in the same process, we have damaged our own spiritual imaginations, and we have also truncated our own theological maturity as we have made excuses not to do the right thing simply because it is difficult. And in just a moment, we'll take a look at a thinker named Matthew Carey, who is a bit of an obscure figure in about 4 different ways. But we will look at depth at a particular work of his that I think will help us begin to think critically about the forms of relationships that we once thought were worthy of sacrificing entire ethnic groups to protect. What is repair? We'll talk about this briefly, and I hope you have more questions about this during our conversation time so that we can get into more detail. We make a distinction at the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms between repair and reparations. And we do that for several reasons. One reason is because we must be very clear that although Presbyterians and other Protestant and Catholic groups have set damages in motion, those damages are far beyond our capacity to repair on our own, given the sizes of our congregations and the sizes of our budgets. Economists like William Darity and others also emphasize that not only do denominations have insufficient funds to repair the damages they've set in motion, individual cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and LA, and individual states also lack the operational budget to repair the damages that have taken place within their jurisdictions as well, meaning that reparations, even for just one ethnic group, will require the funds that are only available through the resources of the nation state itself. But we always, at the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms, reject a counsel of despair just as much as we refuse to throw up our hands and say we are waiting for the federal government to do something, when we know very well there is plenty that we can and must do to repair those things that are distinctly within our wheelhouse and within our lane to repair. When we talk about repair, we are talking about the total process of being transformed from what we have become to who we may become. And that involves, among other things, a transition and transformation from being colonized and colonizing Christians to becoming co-creators of God's new creation. Afterward, we'll say a little bit more about how reparations are defined. But now I'd like to introduce you to Matthew Carey, who lived between 1760 and 1839. He was an immigrant to the United States from Ireland, and he was well known in his day, and he's getting to be a bit better known now than he has been for some decades, as a philosopher, political economist, and very successful and profitable pamphleteer with a wide readership. In a pamphlet that you probably will not find anywhere, no matter how hard you look. But if you'd like a copy of it, please be in touch and we'll make sure that you can find what you'd like to read. But in a pamphlet named Considerations on the Impropriety and Inexpediency of Renewing the Missouri Question, Matthew Carey takes up a very important topic. The Missouri question, of course, is the question about slavery and slave states that was extraordinarily important in the early mid-19th century. Specifically, you may have heard of the Missouri Compromise that, in part, set up what we understand as the Mason-Dixon line, which was the line above which no new states could enter as a slave state into the Union, and the line beneath which states may, if they so choose, enter the Union as a slave state. For Matthew Carey, it was extremely destructive to the peace and harmony of the United States to upset that hard-won and delicate balance between slave states and so-called free states. Later, we'll have to ask how free exactly were those free states given the severity of what many rightly referred to as wage slavery in the industrial North. But I want us to focus in this reading that I'm about to get into, which is a bit dense. I want us to focus on the reasoning that is produced by Matthew Carey. Because nowadays, of course, it's popular to pretend that all people of goodwill always stood on the right side of the slavery debate. But then, of course, how did it last so long if that were the case? And that might also remind us of some of the difficulties we have today understanding one another, whether you want to divide us between blue states and red states, liberals or conservatives, Democratic voters or Republican voters. We have a way of being quite hyperbolic about the way we see ourselves across particular divides. But today's conversation, I hope, will help us understand that it is precisely the legacy of bad, evil notions of unity that have become the bond that continues to prevent us from being the human beings that we must be to continue to live together in peace on this planet. Matthew Carey was adamant that the delicate balance of the Missouri Compromise should not be revisited. And I want us to pay attention to some of the reasoning that he employs. And then in our time of conversation back and forth, I hope we can speak of it in more detail. Whatever, he says, may be the opinions of individuals upon the abstract right of holding human beings in bondage, however deeply they may deplore the existence of slavery in the United States, and however ardently they may desire its extinction, and no one can have a greater abhorrence of this pernicious evil than I have, with all its crimes and miseries. It's the 19th century. They like long sentences, and it's not done. I do conceive the calamities that are likely to spring from the renewal of the discussion to be so much greater and more alarming that no true friend of our happy and blessed union can hesitate which alternative to prefer. To say it another way, he is saying you cannot possibly be a friend of the blessed, peaceful, happy union if you want to raise this question once again. Whether this great and admirable republic is to remain united and prosperous, a monument of the beauty and efficacy of free institutions, or to be violently resolved into its original elements and to become the theater and prey of a fierce intestine conflict. All of that mainly depends on the final settlement of the Missouri question. And by final settlement, he means to stop talking about it, to let it be. If this subject be passed over in harmony, if Missouri be admitted, as she claims to be, on the same footing with Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, that is, with the privilege of determining for herself on the subject of slavery, with the privilege of determining for herself on the subject of slavery, there appears nothing in the perspective from which the Union has aught to apprehend. But if, on the other hand, we are to persist in the determination of shackling her, pun intended, with restrictions, consequences the most awful will probably ensue. Impressed with the opinion that great moral and political mischiefs will follow even from the agitation of the question anew, and believing that an adherence to the principles of the compromise agreed upon last winter is required by reason, humanity, and political expedience, I conceive that no effort should be wanting to prevent a renewal of the discussion. And I'm hoping that you hear some resonances of today's conversations about those things that should be prevented from entering public discussion at all costs. The Missouri question, as it was presented to the consideration of the last session of Congress, was admitted on all sides to be the most delicate and difficult question that had arisen since the adoption of the present Constitution. To the moralist of a foreign nation, the naked question, whether the doors of a new and unpolluted land should be thrown open to the admission of evil, would appear too plain and self-evident to admit of doubt. But when the right to prohibit was denied by those upon whom it was exercised, and the consequences of persisting in the claim appeared in their full magnitude, a different question was presented. On the one hand, was to be considered the probable increase of a servile population, i.e., slaves, at once the curse and reproach of the nation. On the other hand, the possible destruction of our happy republic, the source of prosperity and comforts to the millions of a better race, or at least the certain creation of hostile feelings between the members of a confederacy which, in order that it may all be at all beneficial, requires more than any other species of government the aid of mutual harmony and deference. And again, this is harmony and deference on the question of who has the privilege to choose to enslave other people. Reason, which can never be divorced from philanthropy. Reason, let's repeat that, which can never be divorced from philanthropy, might say to those who opposed the extension of slavery, you have labored nobly in the cause of freedom and in support of the true policy of the Republic. Those whom a mistaken sense of interest or the pride of opinion or local prejudices or constitutional scruples have led to oppose you will at no distant day acknowledge the purity of your motives and the soundness of your views. He's clearly talking about the anti-slavery crowd. Probably he's not talking about the abolitionists because they were considered radicals who did not respect property. You have done well, he says, to the anti-slavery group, and you have gained much. But true philanthropy no more requires of her advocates to enforce her principles at all hazards than true religion expects of her votaries that they should make proselytes with fire and sword. And finally, that section concludes with him saying, the freedom and comfort of the African race are certainly objects worthy a strenuous effort to obtain. But if they are to be bought at the expense of the peace and happiness of this country, the price is too great. When we hear the Apostle Paul instructing Christians in view of God's mercies to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, emphasis, of course, on the living, emphasis on your, not others. That should make us ask questions not about other people whom we're comfortable calling savages, etc., because of obvious barbarities in particular cultures. But we should ask ourselves as people of faith in the land known as the United States for now, what and who have we sacrificed in order to achieve that which we still do not have? What does it mean as human beings, but what does it mean as people who claim God as our creator through Christ, who died with the people? What does it mean that we have as a culture been willing to sacrifice entire ethnic groups across generations in order to hope that in so doing we will achieve peace and harmony? We don't often think about that in the Reformed tradition, and yet we must. And I believe William Carey gives us an opportunity to think about what exactly have we sacrificed in order to achieve this elusive peace, happiness, and national unity. Concerning the peace, happiness, and mutual affection of white Americans, Carey also became an ardent supporter of ecumenism between Catholics and Protestants during a time period where anti-Catholic sentiment was on the rise. An essential component of this ecumenical spirit required securing mutual affection among white Christians by taking up the cause of working-class white women and their children, saving them from the moral and demographic consequences of their abject poverty. This was an important cause that William Carey took up later in his career. One historian writes that just as Carey urged citizens to embrace 18th century sensibility or shared sympathy in his publications to eliminate denominational divisions, Carey also made public appeals on behalf of some of America's most vulnerable citizens, especially marginalized white women and their children, in stark contrast with certain Philadelphia Protestants' demands that those suffering prove their worthiness before charity would be granted. Carey's pleas for boundless Christian empathy, which he extended to Protestants and Catholics alike, embodied a departure from judgment-based benevolence, asking all Americans to view their own humanity through the lives of the suffering. Carey's appeals were important attempts to employ religious sensibility to redeem the assurances of equality inspired by the American Revolution. So again, we see through Carey a desire for the United States to enjoy permanent unity and peace and happiness. And I give Carey something that I grudgingly call the benefit of the doubt when he says that he believed in the abstract that the peace and happiness of the African-descended peoples of the United States to be something worthy of pursuit. And I say I give him the benefit of the doubt, not because I'm trying to give him an easy time, but it's because I'm trying to help us understand together that it's easy to take a shortcut at the expense of other people, especially when you've got an enormous part of society telling you that you are doing the right thing by avoiding difficult problems for the sake of peace and harmony. I don't know if Chicago counts, but I hear in the Midwest, that's kind of a thing that people wrestle with. But Carey, I think, helps us understand that some of the worst problems of racism and coloniality are not the viscera and carnage that we often see in the most hyperbolic rhetoric, but instead they're the quiet bargains that we make in our hearts and the public declarations of peace and unity that require us to continually sacrifice again and again to prevent the dissolution of a unity that cannot survive. Others during that same time period continued to give economic reasons why slavery was good for the United States and all of its people. Louisa McCord, who was also a political economist, and she wrote very interesting things about how slavery gave white women in particular forms of protection and autonomy in a world dominated by white men. But she had this to say about racial slavery, which is the slavery of people of African descent, and wage slavery. And she said, and many said the same thing, which is that the antagonisms of race is working itself out in every instance where two races are put in collision by the quicker or slower extinction of the feebler and inferior race. This has been said by many thinkers, especially in the 19th century. It's called the theory of race contact, that only a handful of things could possibly come about when two races encounter one another. And it's no accident that she understands race as a relation between inferior and superior. And I like to remind us that it's not just a clever turn of phrase to say that race is a construct that is not real. We do understand that racism has real effects, but in a reformed context, we must remember, even as we fight racism, even as we promote reparation, we cannot solve the problem created by race by pretending that the concept of race is anything but an invention to produce inferiority and superiority. I'm not a language police, but I'll just kind of put it out there to you to continue to think that conversations, or phrases rather, like racial equality, racial harmony, racial justice, racial healing are quite oxymoronic. There is no healing that can take place that is predicated on race. We cannot lose sight of the creation of race and the damage that it's done, but we have to start thinking outside of these terms that we have created so that we can imagine a world that really does exist where the problems caused by the invention of race have been solved. Louisa McCord goes on to say, under racial slavery, enslaved workers' family ties and social affections are respected and indulged in a greater degree than those of any laboring class in the world. Another thinker said this about the value of slavery for all workers. In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, and fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class, which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government. You might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose, to her hand. And we are old-fashioned at the South yet. Slave is a word discarded now by ears polite. I will not characterize that class at the North by that term, but you have it. It is there. It is everywhere. It is eternal. And I will add, just in case you're wondering, who is being referred to by that class at the North? He's not talking about people of African descent. He is talking about people of European descent who need to work for a living. He is among those who also understood them as enslavable people, at least in potential. And there are other thinkers during this time period who were of the opinion that if you must work for me, for your wages, why must I put up with you as someone with whom I must contend politically? Which is to say, folks like George Fitzhugh, who was also a political economist, sociologist, believed that at some point all labor should be compelled and controlled in order to make sure that progress continues and the United States can compete with other European nations. And if that has resonance for you in this day and time, as you see the direction our government and our politics are moving, please know that you are not speculating, but you are thinking right along the lines of folks like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and others. And I'll just throw this out there. There's a book called Crack Up Capitalism. I highly recommend this book if you are a person who wants to understand what is the whole of which our current economic policies on the right are a part, including Project 2025. Some of the ideas in Project 2025, all of them are bad. Some of them actually sound like they're bad. The fact that they sound like they're bad, we might be inspired by the absurd sound of some of those provisions and endeavors. We might be inspired to think that they're not serious. We might be inspired to think that there are not successive decades of activity across the planet of which Project 2025 is merely a part. This book, Crack Up Capitalism, and I apologize that I haven't memorized the author's name, but this book will give you an understanding of exactly what is the whole of which our current shenanigans in Washington are a part. And the book is chilling, and it should inspire you to find new ways to connect and form allegiances with people who still think that democracy is something other than a failed dream. This concept of the mudsill, by the way, I had to look this up when I was a graduate student. Mudsill is an architectural term, and I'm not an architect and I'm not going to get it right, but it simply refers to like the very bottom of an edifice upon which the building is actually set up to be steady and to last for a long time. So the mudsill of your society, that's the people who do all the things that are necessary for others to do that which people believe leads toward progress. It was understood as, the word here I think is fortunate that Senator James Henry Hammond uses. Others in other places use the term providentially. God has given a race that is suited to do the dirty work so that white men do not have to fight one another over who is on the permanent bottom of the economy. This is providential from certain racist perspectives. Elsewhere, others have said, when we are free, this is before emancipation, when we are free from this plague spot of slavery, the curse to our industry, our education, our politics, our religion, we shall increase more rapidly in number and still more abundantly be rich. By peaceful purchase, the Anglo-Saxon may acquire the rest of this North American continent. Then what a nation we shall one day become. America, the mother of 1,000 Anglo-Saxon states on both sides of the equator, and count her children at last by hundreds of millions, and among them all, behold, no tyrant and no slave. This is Unitarian minister Theodore Parker in 1854. And I will note that Theodore Parker was one of the most self-sacrificial abolitionists in his day. And I say abolitionist, not merely a sentimental anti-slaver. And yet, he understood that the end of slavery would not be the beginning of multi-ethnic democracy, but it would be a service to the Anglo-Saxon people of this continent that would finally give them moral credibility to become global leaders among the family of European nations. Abraham Lincoln once said in a campaign speech, as part of one nation, its people now find and may forever find their way to Europe by New York, to South America and Africa by New Orleans, and to Asia by San Francisco. But separate our common country into two nations as designed by the present rebellion, that is the Civil War, and every man of this great interior region is thereby cut off from some one or more of these outlets, not perhaps by a physical barrier, but by embarrassing and onerous trade regulations. So this helps us remember that Abraham Lincoln, as was typical of that day, was also interested in ending slavery, not for the purposes of multi-ethnic democracy, but to avoid a situation where the southern states could secede from the Union and make it difficult for the United States to have access to what it refers to sometimes as its backyard in the Caribbean or Asia by other means, and Africa. It's okay, of course, to be concerned with money, but we must remember that in our nation, the greatest evil, one of the greatest evils that has ever existed, was opposed, and thankfully so, but for not all of the right reasons. And that matters, not because we're obsessed with pretending that we are morally superior to others, but we now have in our hands multiple problems to solve that were not solved during the time period when it could have been done so. Albion Tourget. Albion Tourget is not a well-known name nowadays, but I like to mention him because if there was ever such a thing as a best friend of the freed person after the Emancipation Proclamation outside of the African American community, it is probably Albion Tourget. Albion Tourget was a judge during the Reconstruction era, which was a time period and a context that was so dangerous that white men hired by the federal government were vulnerable to mob attacks simply by trying to do their jobs. And he did that job at great expense to himself financially and to his own health. And nevertheless, when the question about reparations came up, Albion Tourget had three things to say. One, slavery opened to the slave not only the pathway of civilization, but the gate of heaven. Therefore, reparations demands would jeopardize civil rights for Afro-Americans. I'm not sure what he would say is jeopardizing them today. It certainly would not be reparations. And third, he said, reparations demands nourish a sense of injustice and ingratitude that distracts from the cheerful recognition of their true status and duties of citizenship. So these examples, I hope, give us a sense of why, when we talk about reparative justice today and reparations, most people of goodwill feel very comfortable describing what is right, necessary, and possible as if perhaps it's right, but maybe not possible, and maybe as an unnecessary stress on an already fragile nation. But you notice this nation has been fragile for quite some time. America has engaged in and has maintained a particular kind of fragility, actual and strategic, I believe. When it comes to our thinking as Christian people, we often miss the opportunity to be transformed, as the Apostle Paul said, by the renewal of our minds. And we have multiple opportunities to do just that. And there are two examples I'll share with you here briefly. Again, not of right-wing extremists, but of people that we've probably read before or have heard of before and have found their work to be useful, as I have. But there's a subtle problem here, and I'm hoping that somebody will bring this up in our Q&A. In a promotional video that I found on YouTube, Jennifer Harvey, author of a very useful book, Dear White Christians, said the following to the interviewer. She said, "I watch white students breathe a huge sigh of relief and realize not only can they talk about race and own our racial history, but she finds that it is liberating to do so. It feels good to feel like you can set things right, even though that's going to be a long-term, imperfect process. We will never set things right in this country," she says. But the work of doing it is very liberating. So take this in. This experience of feeling liberated while working on something that you also think will not take place. Now, if we had an opportunity to ask Dr. Harvey, can you explain what you really meant by that? Is that really what you think? she might explain it in such a way that would resolve some of the questions that we have. Or she might explain it in such a way that would help us understand the politics of publishing a book with a particular printer whose name I will not name. However, another writer writing a book for a publisher I will not name today said something very similar in just a little brief subordinate clause of a sentence in an otherwise interesting book. Jemar Tisby says, though the work of racial justice is difficult and will never truly end in this life, God has provided a colorful portrait of the goal. And then he just kind of lost me, and I don't know what he said after that. So I went back and I said, what do you mean will never truly end in this life? Because I thought at first he meant lifetime. And then I flipped open and I said, well, who published this book? And I'm like, oh, okay, I understand. You have to say certain things. But what does it mean again for us to take a historically emergent phenomenon like racism and white supremacy and coloniality and reparations denial and say in God's face, this is difficult and will never truly end in this life? It reminds me of a book that I once thought was titled in an overly hyperbolic way, which is God a White Racist? And I thought, oh, it's an eye-catching title, but oh, isn't it a little bit too much? But then when I look at the implied logic of what Brother Tisby has to say here and with what Dr. Jennifer Harvey said, I realize we do have a problem in our country telling the truth about difficult things. And it reminds me of a song that's not of my generation, but maybe some of your generation, by Gil Scott-Heron. I don't know if you know Gil Scott-Heron. His most famous piece is maybe "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." There's another briefer song, and pardon the term, I don't mean to offend, but there's another song he has called "Whitey on the Moon." And in this song, he rehearses the reality that politicians often say, that solving the economic problems that people face in urban ghettos is too big to deal with. And yet people can figure out how to get from the surface of the earth to the moon and back. And I think we should think that way as we think Christianly about what does it mean to be members of a reformed tradition, trying to solve problems caused by historically emergent phenomena. I think one of the first things that we must do is agree that we must encounter one another again, that we must indeed have a great re-encounter where we acknowledge the power of the Holy Spirit to transform us through the renewing of our minds. For so long in our culture, we have not only done the wrong thing and told ourselves it was the best that can be done, but we've also looked at the damage done, and we have proceeded as if fixing that damage and correcting that legacy would damage the nation, and therefore that's a good enough reason not to pursue repairs in earnest. Now this afternoon, I'm not here, or this morning rather, I'm not here to promote any particular form of reparations or reparative justice, although I have some ideas. But what I urge us to do as Christian people is to stop giving ballast to the notion that somehow what has gone wrong in the past has no legacy today, which is not what we really do in the middle of the road or on the left. But what we do and what we should stop doing is pretending that there is no way to solve those problems and arrest those legacies now, so that future generations are not negatively impacted by the unfaithfulness and the ingratitude through which we refuse to take the power of the Holy Spirit seriously enough to repair historic harms. So I've gone a little bit over, but I'm going to run through a few things briefly, because I don't want you to think that the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms is only a backward-glancing institution or ministry that doesn't look forward. In our Christian tradition, we have engaged in many forms of harm, and I'm looking toward what we've done recently. But rather than just remember the harms that we have created and articulating them very beautifully and writing books about them, our General Assembly has tasked us with actually repairing historic harms. When I first took this job, I had no idea what Presbyterians had been up to in Juneau, Alaska. And yet the General Assembly had taken the time to learn what Presbyterians had been up to in Juneau, Alaska, and they gave the Center for Repair our first assignment, which was to offer reparations of $1 million plus and to create an official apology for one particular incident that took place in 1963 in Juneau, Alaska, which was a very unceremonious and unchristian way of closing down a church and dismissing its Native American, Indigenous American pastor. And we took 3 days of ceremony and reconciliation in 2023 to do what it took to satisfy the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples of Southeast Alaska, to satisfy their need to atone for the harm Presbyterians had done to their ancestors. That work is still ongoing, and I'll say more about it when we talk to one another. This is just a picture here of the ceremony where ancestors were invited to the congregation to witness acts of apology, reconciliation, and repair. You see President Richard Peterson here on the left side of the screen of the Tlingit and Haida Tribal Association. And here, of course, you see the son of the Reverend Dr. Walter Sobolev, who was the pastor that was unceremoniously released from his position in a very harmful way to the entire clan that he belonged to. This is not Walter Sobolev Jr., but Sasha Sobolev. And of course, on the right side, you see singing and chanting and dancing that took place once the individuals were able to atone for in public the dishonor that had been done to their relatives. And please know that when I spoke behind closed doors to tribal authorities, they made it very clear to me that no apology and no reparations will be accepted if you, young man, and I'm not that young anymore, do not promise us today to come back and engage the full context of Presbyterian colonial activity in Juneau, Alaska, which I have done and I continue to do. Not just Juneau, Alaska, but Alaska in general. You may have heard that part of the harm that was done during this time period was on the level of culture and language. And here in the middle of this picture, you see the Dr. Rosita Worrell, which I believe is the first indigenous woman to get a PhD in anthropology from Harvard University. At this time, she was 80 years old, and she told us on this particular day, as she is flanked by a brilliant linguist on her left side and on her right side, the tribal president. She spoke to a delegation from the PCUSA and said that last night, I'm trying to move this icon that's blocking me. She said, last night, as I thought about the words I would share with you, my memories brought me back to the period when I was 6 years old and kidnapped and brought to Haynes House, a Presbyterian mission school. I am a strong woman, but last night I shed tears as my adult body became that of the 6-year-old who cried in her bed, wondering why I had been taken from my family. I'm remembering her voice because I was there as she spoke. The punishment I endured would today be called child abuse. And that's an understatement. She described, among many things, a process by which older girls were instructed and held responsible for administering corporal punishment to younger girls if they were caught speaking the devil's language or their native languages. And this was not done just to be mean. This was done because Presbyterians had received funding and instructions from the federal government to participate in the extinction of a group of indigenous languages and other cultural practices for the express purposes of scattering and fragmenting those communities so that those lands could be given to timber, gold, fishing, and later oil interests, which took place. Now, part of the repair, that we are continuing to be engaged in with tribal authorities and activists involve language preservation activities, repatriating human remains from former Presbyterian boarding schools and other properties, as well as working with the legal establishment of the PCUSA to do what we can to help repatriate sacred objects. In 2023, the Center for Repair was also invited to take a reconciliatory trip with our co-moderators to Ghana and to Liberia. And it was in Liberia that I was asked to do something that I never like to do, which is give a devotional to a group of people I've never met in a context I know nothing about. So of course, I did it anyway. And I gave a devotional where I put a suggestion on the table based on a book that I had read called Slaves to Racism. And in that book, someone lamented, the author that is, lamented and asked, what if Africans from the United States left the context of slavery and arrived in Liberia not as colonizing missionaries, but as equal partners in a nation-building project? Why, I asked in a devotion about Romans 12, verses 1 through 2, don't we make a decision to do now what could have been done before? Why don't we re-encounter one another in that way? And shortly after, I received in the email, as did our stated clerk and many others, a call for repair from the youth desk at the Liberia Council of Churches, and that has resulted in very important work that I would love to say more about later, and perhaps you have read about. Recently, just this past week, July 16, in an article that I have to admit I have not read thoroughly yet because I've been quite busy, but I hear it's a good article and I believe it. But the article's title, as you can see, is Center for Repair of Historic Harms launches Liberia Project 180. We call it Liberia Project 180 because should the General Assembly decide to pass the overture that we are sending, we will be poised to celebrate with Liberians the 180th anniversary of Liberia's independence, not from the United States, but Liberia's independence from the Presbyterian co-founded American Colonization Society. More about that later. But we are very excited to be currently working with a group of 6 researchers from Liberia whose research will help us understand what to say to the General Assembly that is the will of the Liberian people for a transformed re-encounter with the Presbyterian Church after such a rocky and difficult beginning. I'll close this very, very briefly by reminding us that the call to repair is not something that we do as Presbyterians simply because we are trying to jump on, once again, the latest bandwagon of social justice. We are actually doing things that need to be done that aren't being done yet by others according to the specific relationships that we have engaged in historically with people in this country and around the world. The section on reconciliation and society in my favorite confession, the Confession of 1967, reminds us that God's reconciliation in Jesus is the ground of the peace, justice, and freedom among nations, which all powers of government are called to serve and defend. The church, in its own life, is called to practice the forgiveness of enemies and to commend to the nations as practical politics the search for cooperation and peace. This search requires that the nations pursue fresh and responsible relations across every line of conflict, even at the risk to national security. Can you believe that Presbyterians had this to say in 1967? At the risk of national security. If we could live into those things that the Holy Spirit prompts us to say, and we can, to reduce areas of strife and to broaden international understanding. Reconciliation among nations becomes particularly urgent as countries develop nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, diverting human power and resources from constructive uses and risking the annihilation of humankind. Although nations may serve God's purposes in history, the church, which identifies the sovereignty of any one nation, in their lobbying groups, or any one way of life with the cause of God denies the lordship of Christ and betrays its calling. Further, the reconciliation of humankind through Jesus Christ makes it plain that enslaving poverty in a world of abundance is an intolerable violation of God's good creation. An intolerable violation. Because Jesus identified himself with the needy and exploited, the cause of the world's poor is the cause of Jesus' disciples. The church cannot condone poverty, whether it is the product of unjust social structures, exploitation of the defenseless, lack of national resources, absence of technological understanding, or rapid expansion of populations. The church calls all people to use their abilities, their possessions, and the fruits of technology as gifts entrusted to them by God for the maintenance of their families and the advancement of the common welfare. It encourages those forces in human society that raise hopes for better conditions and provides people with opportunity for a decent living. A church that is indifferent to poverty or evades responsibility in economic affairs, or is open to one social class only, or expects gratitude for its beneficence, makes a mockery of reconciliation and offers no acceptable worship to God. This is all the way back in 1967. And we still, thanks be to God, have an opportunity today to live into the promise that was put on paper back in 1967. I thank you so much for your attention, and I thank you for listening this morning.
Thank you. Reverend Jermaine, I want you to have a seat, and we'll continue the conversation. I also want to invite Janet up. I think Janet's... Okay, Janet will be right back. I'll invite her up, or if someone could just tell her to come up afterwards. And Janet will help each of you get involved in the conversation. And I believe Margie's also monitoring the online chat, and there are likely some questions and comments online. And so just let Janet know, Margie, and she'll bring the microphone to you as well. But Reverend Jermaine, I just want to thank you again for your powerful words this morning. I've got one question, and then I'm going to kick it out to everybody else here, because I can tell people are chomping at the bit to really get engaged in this conversation. But the word that came to mind as I was listening to your remarks, often when we speak of God, one quality or of our walk with God we often talk about in the church world is fear. And we do a lot of unpacking of that word, fear, in worship and in teaching. We tend to think of fear as something that makes us solely afraid, but the biblical words surrounding fear tend to also include awe or wonder. It's the kind of fear and awe and wonder that you might have when you're standing on the precipice of a cliff and you're looking out at the horizon, the vista, but you also know that you have a fear of heights, and then you realize, oh my goodness, when you look down below. And that's kind of the feeling that I got when you both presented challenges to us, but also encouraged us and inspired us to use our imagination to believe that the world can be different, to really see a world beyond racism, beyond racial capitalism, as good news that is possible. Even if not in our lifetime, it's possible in this life, because Jesus comes to give us life abundant, not just later, but now. So thank you for helping us to kind of stand on the precipice, to understand some concepts, to really think and discern in a place where we might be a little fearful, or it might feel trepidatious, or we might wonder our capacity to do what you've called us to do, but we know that it is possible. So here's my question for you. We live in a time of in which our news environment, where we get information, how we hear stories, is very cluttered. And it's hard to make heads or tails of anything that we hear. Social media has this way of just churning through conversations and having us engage not in discernment, but really combat and debate. In that environment, how do we find our way to dealing with repair in a way that isn't just a shortcut, or isn't just about giving us false comfort, or comfort through an outrage, or sending off an angry missive on social media? How do we get beyond the challenges that our news and information environment offer us these days?
It's a great question. You mentioned fear and the fear of God, and I do think, and I think you do as well, I think we have to be careful with fear, because fear can be overdone. But at the same time, when I think about fearing God, I'm tempted to say, oh, I don't fear God, I love God, because God loves me and God's great. But then I remember that God is great, and God does love me, and God loves the other person as much as God loves me. And if my relationship is not what it ought to be, I should make it right. Because if being who I want to be is at the expense of someone else, then I need to fear being on God's bad side. Not because God is going to exact some kind of punishment aimed at me in some kind of superstitious way. But it's to say, for example, what would I say? For example, if my understanding of what is great in the world depended on establishing and maintaining an apartheid regime, I should be fearful of putting all my eggs in that basket, because I know that a just God cannot allow that to stand in perpetuity. So there's a sense of fear. But I think that fear helps me put in perspective another type of fear. For example, when I was doing my doctoral exams at Union Theological Seminary, I had among 4 exams to do one exam that dealt with a social problem in a form just like this, as a public lecture. And I decided, since I was right next door to Riverside Church, where the Black Manifesto was read out loud, I want to go in those archives and figure out, what did that church have to say about that demand for reparations that came from James Forman. And I want to do my public lecture on the theological implications of reparations denial. And when I tell you that every variety of leftist who was in a position to tell me no, told me, I don't think that's a great idea. Oh, that's kind of a losing topic. Oh, it's kind of a divisive topic. And part of me, there was a part of me that was afraid, because that's a stage in your career where you want to be known as someone who can take good advice. But then at the same time, in the course of my research, sometimes we encounter our ancestors in ways that I guess don't have to be explained in public. But, one of our cultural ancestors, Queen Mother Audley Moore, she wrote a pamphlet where she called out, what did she call them? I'll try to say it in a churchy way. She was a communist, who kept a pearl-handled revolver, in her brassiere, and followed Marcus Garvey. But I'll just paraphrase to say that she wrote about these PhD African-American individuals who ignore reparations and instead promote these poverty programs as if our people are poor because they haven't worked. And there was something about my encounter with that ancestor in the archive, of all places, where I'm sure she never thought she would be, the Schaumburg Center. That encounter made me fearful of the fact that I come from a poor background in rural southeast Texas, and I'm dwelling as a graduate student in the rarefied air of Columbia University. What am I there for if not to finish unfinished work left undone by my ancestors? And might I be more fearful of being a useless person in their eyes than, running afoul of the opinion of some exam readers? And so I would say for people who look at all the rancor on social media, and I read it a lot, because in my work, I just want to know, what are the naysayers saying, so I can see if there's truth to it, or so I can see how to debunk what they're saying. But if that's not the work that you do, I think people should give themselves permission to just skip a lot of it. Because a lot of what we encounter in social media is toxic. And it's created in order to make us so filled with rage that our voting patterns and shopping patterns become predictable, but that we don't actually talk to one another across these ideological divides and figure out what's happening with you, what's happening with me, what's happening with them, and where is the middle ground where we can meet and move our vital interests forward. I would be more fearful of missing an opportunity to be useful and move things forward. And I would be more fearful of future generations asking, what were you doing over there with those people if you didn't help us arrive on the planet with our problems in a better place than they were when you were born? I'm more fearful of that nowadays than to be considered impertinent or too idealistic by folks who have yet to understand the importance and the viability of reparations.
Thank you. And I think about the fear of missing out, FOMO. There's FOMO for what we could be doing,
right,
for the sake of God's beloved community, which is here and now. And why would we wait?
Right.
The food's getting cold, so why do you wait? It's time to feast, Okay, I know there are some good questions out there. So Janet, thank you so much for helping. We'll come to you.
Good morning. Thank you for speaking on such a difficult topic with such grace and such clarity.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the respectfulness and the way in which you address this topic. I didn't want to come. I didn't know what was going to happen. But anyway, my question is, I would like to know what you meant by strategic fragility.
I'm very glad you asked. I think there is, so that long section of Matthew Carey's writing that we read reflects a fear, or at least the capacity to produce a fear, that if I do the right thing, I will be the cause of the entire national fabric falling apart. I mean, it was a veritable cottage industry in the 19th century to cause people to think that if you push abolitionism, you will be responsible for the United States no longer being a viable national project. I think that tactic, and it's not entirely untrue. I mean, the United States may fail anyway. And trying to push people in the United States to do the right thing, it may cause this country to utterly collapse in such a manner that we have to then, write a new constitution, make a new Bill of Rights, make a new Declaration of Independence. Not that I'm looking forward to that. But when I talk about strategic fragility, I think it has to do with knowing that technique worked, making people afraid of being the cause of dissolution, and then using that as a method to apply to other situations. Like J.D. Vance recently gave an address to the Claremont Institute, which I don't typically follow, but sometimes I just have to watch a train wreck. And J.D. Vance suggested that all Americans should hold other Americans in permanent suspicion if they do not speak of the United States in terms of gratitude, instead of describing the United States as having a fatal flaw or having some kind of basic contradiction or simply not being at its best. And again, I think that works because it has already been proven that Americans can withhold what they know is right or not pursue what they think is right if they are presented with the notion of America as so fragile. So I think Obama probably understood that better than most. Obama is one of my favorite politicians to read, and J.D. Vance is getting to be there as well. Not because I agree with what they say or appreciate their approach, but I think they're smart enough rhetorically to know what buttons to push to make people recoil back from doing the right thing because of its risks. So when Obama said that reparations was a non-starter in his presidency because he didn't think, and he said this in multiple places, in his memoirs, on the podcast, and other places, that he thought, immigrants wouldn't go for it, white Americans wouldn't go for it, and so I can't deal with it. I think it's not only the fragility of someone preoccupied with their legacy, as he was, is, and continues to be, but it's also the sense in which Americans will fight and do violent things if it seems as if you're going to take their money, make them use a pronoun that they're not familiar with, or make them share space with someone that they don't want to share it with. So it's not untrue that it can be dangerous to try to pursue justice in earnest. But I do think people overread how delicate the situation is and use that as a historically proven technique to say, oh, I'll always point to the ideal, but we always keep our feet firmly planted in material reality, which is to say we give lip service to what is right, but then we only do what's expedient. And when we push people to do the right thing, we are very quick to say, oh, well, we could do the right thing, but it's more important to win this election. Or we're trying to save democracy, so suddenly genocide and ethnic cleansing is complicated. Or we've got to make sure we get this person in office. We don't have time for democracy right now. So that's what I mean by strategic, like a strategic way of being delicate.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. I have a question. Can I get you first?
Thank you, Jermaine. I'm Regan Burke. It's really nice to see you again.
Likewise.
So I appreciate the repair and reparations that you've done in Juneau and in Ghana. Is it Ghana? Yeah. So, but here, where you're sitting, this land was stolen from the Potawatomi, and it was built with money from slave economy, from the McCormick Reaper, right? So that's where we stand and that's where we sit. And yet, when some of us try to bring that forward, or an idea forward of how we can reckon with that publicly, where it's what you just described. It's too fragile, right? We can't do that, right? We've got too many people here who are like, oh no, that was in the past. We can't face that. And so, of course, what we could do is give the land back and rent it from the Potawatomi. That's happened in other places, and it would be a great way to express repair and reparations. But the repair needed to do that on our side, the interior repair. People say that would take a long time, right? Yes. Which you just refuted. At any rate, I want to know if in your office, right, or in the work that you're doing that with white churches around the country, and not just in the South, of course, and not just, the Presbyterians that are now our enemies in the South, but in the PCUSA churches, many of them are built on stolen land, and many of them are built with, especially, all the churches in Washington, D.C. are built with, slave-based economies, right? And not to mention the Catholic ones, Georgetown, et cetera. So I just want to know if your office, or if you have given a direction to do that in churches like ours.
Thank you so much for the question. As I'm answering that, I am looking for a piece of data. I'm not going to find it. So the short answer is yes. Let's see. Next week, I will be very happy to be at San Gabriel Presbytery in Southern California for a land back ceremony. that is taking place, because that congregation has been very faithful and has worked with a local indigenous nation to find the appropriate manner in which to give land back that the church is built on, which is stolen land. More broadly, however, we're working with a few different groups to figure out how do we equip churches with the right information to know how to do a number of things. How do you research the history of your land so that you know whose labor potentially was stolen to build your property, whose land was stolen to give that property some space, but also how do you learn what tribal protocols exist so that any land back process can happen in a way that makes sense to tribal authorities according to the law and according to tribal traditions. That's a little bit difficult, but thankfully I'll have a couple of weeks, starting next week, in the Twin Cities to talk with some indigenous leaders about what they recommend to set up a process for churches to be able to do that. So the short answer is yes, churches are asking questions about it. How do we start thinking about this? How do we talk with the right tribal lawyers? How do we research the history? What are the legal problems associated with it? And my favorite is, how do you persuade the session to know that this is doable? The reason why I say that's my favorite is because you know something is serious when you have to figure out how to persuade the session to take it seriously. And hopefully very soon we'll be able to release and share with all of you a video that was taken, well, it's been in the works for a while, but it's almost done. But it's a video that is taken at, I'm forgetting the name of this church, although I worked there. Oak Grove Presbyterian Church. Oak Grove Presbyterian Church is an old congregation in Bloomington, Minnesota, who, when I was pastor there, thought reparations sounded like a really bad idea and counterproductive and perhaps discouraging to people who have already believed that they did the right thing in the civil rights era. And when I did my doctoral work at Union Theological Seminary, I was very glad not to have to fight that battle at that local church. But not long after I left, I was contacted by that church, and people said, we've thought about what you said about repair and reparations, and we've started an organization called Restorative Actions, and we want to know if you'd like to be a part of it with us. Long story short, Oak Grove Presbyterian Church went through a process with the session and with its members in order to determine how to go about surrendering a symbolic portion of wealth in light of the fact that that church's land is, of course, on stolen indigenous land, and some other things that I probably shouldn't talk about yet in public. But the video that I'm looking forward to sharing with folks goes through the details of how did you persuade your congregation members? How did you engage the naysayers? How did you persuade the clerk of session? How did you get that started even in the middle of having an interim pastor, instead of waiting until the senior pastor came? And how did that process get handed off smoothly so that the senior pastor also bought into it as well? We often don't do that kind of documentation. And I think sometimes we're so eager to jump on the latest, flashiest social justice bandwagon that we don't really play our role. And we don't really, I don't know how to say that. Like sometimes it's almost as if being Christians in the Reformed tradition is not enough. But we think it's flashier to join what someone else is doing. But then when you think about, well, why don't we have reparations now? Well, it's because of people like all of us, because we haven't decided to do it yet. We always think somebody else is going to do it, or we think it's too hard or it's too radical. But the purpose of that video is to be encouraging and instructive to the local church so that you can see not how someone reached this glorious social justice moment on the mountaintop, but instead how to see what's more interesting to me is how does any local congregation go from 0 to 1 in reparative justice activity, because I think that's where the majority of our constituents are and our fellow church members. We're at 0 looking to see how do we get to 1. And I think once that move is made, then it's much easier to continue going because you've done the heavy lifting. And so more of that material will be made available, and I really appreciate the question.
Yes. Hi, I'm Peg Griffiths, long-term member of Fourth. Thank you for inspiring and challenging remarks. And I just wanted to add to Pastor Joe's FOMO. It's good to be on the right side of history, no matter how long it takes. So my question is, I'm curious, I'm a history buff, and I know the Presbyterian Church was way in the beginning, and John Knox in Scotland was like the first church to admit Jews to their university in Scotland back in those days. And the denomination has gone through many changes, and I'm just wondering what changes. I know that they went against slavery at some point in time, and then there were splits in the congregation, and there were splits more when women and gays were ordained, etc. I just like a little of that history. And then the question is, to what extent do you feel supported by General Assembly and PCUSA structure for the work that you're doing at this point in time? And you're mentioning wonderful things that are going on, but to what extent is this resonating in the General Assembly?
Thank you for the question. So the General Assembly in 2022 decided there should be a Center for the Repair of Historic Harms. I did not hear about that until Synod School, which I'll be going to Synod School next week. And I heard at Synod School in 2022, the General Assembly, they just started the Center for Repair. You should apply. And I'm like, oh, they're not going to do it right. I don't want to look at that. And then I started talking to different people to see, well, are they giving it a lot of resources? Are they giving it enough room to actually do and be what it should be? And I was persuaded from what I heard that I should at least try to apply. At the same time that they decided to establish a Center for the Repair of Historic Harms, that same General Assembly announced that we must offer repair and reparations and an official apology for what took place in Juneau, Alaska in 1963. So all of that is to say I was impressed by what the General Assembly did at that time, so much so that I decided to kind of pump the brakes a little bit on my dissertation in order to see what I could do to help that work get its strongest possible start. I'll have a different answer for you, and of course a more positive answer for you after the General Assembly of 2026, because then the General Assembly will have, hopefully, passed an overture that we plan to bring that will provide an official apology to the indigenous people of Liberia for the racist and colonial manner Presbyterians encountered them. And I'm hoping that the General Assembly will also approve the reparative measures that will be co-produced by the expert panel in Liberia that has just begun their work this month. So overall, I really have reason to be excited and optimistic about the General Assembly because it's made up of all of you. And I think people understand that now is the time to actually do those things that our documents going back to the Confession of 1967 have been telling us to do. But now is the time to figure out what do those words mean in terms of administration, which is a challenging and fun way to look at things. But overall, I'm encouraged by the foresight of the General Assembly and the support and the resources that have been given. Just this past General Assembly has asked that, for example, the Center for Repair work with the Hispanic Latino Caucus to get to the bottom of this, I almost said strategic, that's not what I meant, systemic and structural underpayment of Puerto Rican clergy. And they allocated over $50,000 to do a research project that will produce answers to, well, we don't know yet, but how much has that cost? What has been the impact? And to then develop with that caucus, what are the reparative measures that are being called for? The General Assembly has already said, hey, go do that. Here's over $50,000 to begin that research. And I have all the faith in the world that when that research is produced, we will see more of the fine details of what needs to be repaired and that the General Assembly will support that. Also, I should say the General Assembly also gave us a huge assignment in 2022, which is an enormous research component, but the purpose of it is to allow congregations of color who struggle to call full-time pastors, whether it's a CRE or full-time installed leadership to actually work together as a multi-agency coalition, to work with mid-council leaders and local pastors to see what can be done. Well, not to see what can be done, but to fund the installation of pastoral leadership in those congregations, plus benefits that will be handled, of course, by the Board of Pensions for at least 3 years. Part of the challenge to that is it's really hard to find out who are all these churches, because if you're an underfunded church, that means you don't have someone checking the email for surveys to fill out for national headquarters. So right now we are working with 5 different mid-council leaders from rural to urban areas and from Midwest, Detroit in this case, and West Coast and East Coast to find out, okay, let's do a small-scale pilot to see what processes work to get full-time pastoral leadership in congregations of color. And that work is ongoing right now. So this is fascinating for me because this is the General Assembly saying yes, not only to reparations writ large, but also taking a multi-ethnic approach and taking an approach that's relevant to our congregations. And at the same time, it is giving us a mandate that allows us to try to understand what does repair and reparation look like, not only as it concerns us as an institution looking inward, which we must do, but how do we partner with other organizations that are working toward reparations, not only for the Afro-American people, but reparations for indigenous Americans according to what they're calling for, and repairs even beyond the United States as our relationships make doing so natural. So lots of encouragement, not a complaint from me. If I had one complaint, it's the same complaint I have with everything else, which is that why is it taking so long? And why can't we do it a little faster? But I think we're moving as a denomination in the right direction, which unfortunately we can't say that for every institution in our nation. But I do think we can feel, I don't want to say proud because that's a little too much, but I think we can feel confident that we are responding to the Holy Spirit pointing us in the right direction in a way that I think is appropriate and in some cases praiseworthy.
Do we have time for more questions? Yes, maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. Here in the front.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for your message, and certainly thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
Do you have any practical advice for the people in this room or for this church to try to advance the cause, things that we could reasonably do?
Certainly.
Well, if you can share some of them, although we don't have all day.
I would love to. So our center takes what we call a call and response repair ethic, which means there are a million things that require repair. And so we begin with responding to a call for repair. If this congregation is interested in general in furthering the ministry of repair, then we know we can have a Zoom call and brainstorm and talk about a lot of different options. For example, researching the history of this congregation and understanding, how did it get here? Was anyone displaced by the building of this church or something of that sort? Was the church's construction related in some way to slaves, from funding from enslavement, et cetera, et cetera? That's always a possibility. If there's an interest, for example, so I'm really excited about the work that we're doing with Liberia Project 180. And part of what we've been asked to do as a center is to pay attention to opportunities to get Presbyterian resources, especially the best of Presbyterian theology, in the hands of people who can translate it into local, meaning indigenous languages, so that people can then do the work that they say should have started 200 years ago, which is the process of Africanizing their response to the gospel in the Reformed tradition, much in the same way as Europeans have had an opportunity to Europeanize their response to the gospel in an appropriate way. And some inappropriate ways too. And so there are opportunities to learn about that work and to learn about how to help fund that work. Specifically, we are hoping that when we finish our overture to the General Assembly, we will be able to ask the General Assembly to consider funding the translation of selected theological materials into all 16 or 15, because English is the official language, 15 or 16 indigenous languages of Liberia, which is a lengthy process and it's expensive. In the moment, there are 2 translations taking place of the Confession of 1967. And again, when I spoke with Liberian indigenous elders a couple of months ago when I traveled there, they said, we don't have really good Presbyterian theological materials in our native languages. Like, can you help us with the funding of translating those things so that we can then take those and figure out how do we respond to those within our indigenous cosmologies and life ways? And we have begun that process. And that process is not so expensive to just do one confession into 2 indigenous languages. But as I told my brother, Reverend Joe, if there is any interest in conversation about how to work together and partner to make some of these small-scale repairs happen, then we would love to do so, as there is a relationship historically with Liberia, Presbyterianism, and Chicago.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, Janet, could I have the mic? Just want to close us out. Thank you. Reverend Jermaine, I did want to just ask you to share maybe a little bit of the analogy when we were just talking before the lecture today about what repair looks like. And you mentioned an analogy, I think, with pipes and with trying to put in repair in certain pipes. And I just thought that was a beautiful way of just helping us to interpret for others who we know, both in this congregation and our community at large, the importance of repair, but also how natural of a process it is rather than something that is imposed on us from on high.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was just sharing with Reverend Joe that someone shared with me the work that they do some years ago with nanotechnology, which I don't know anything about nanotechnology, so forgive my very crude summary. But they were working on nanotechnology that would be used to clean and repair the inside of oil pipelines without having to stop the flow of oil while the repair is being done. And if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm probably not, it has something to do with nanoscopic biological mechanical entities that could help metabolize some of the materials that would clog up the pipelines. But it's too expensive, I heard, to just stop the flow while you're doing these repairs extraordinarily frequently. And so these are just forms of technology that help routine and ongoing repairs take place, not as a exceptional activity, but as a routine activity. And I think in the same way, by analogy, building a church, constructing theologies, building a nation and raising it up, even if we place to the side obvious things like slavery and genocide, those are activities that are productive, that also cause wear and tear, to use an analogy, and those require routine maintenance. And I think my greatest hope for the ministry of repair in the Reformed tradition, aside from actually repairing these huge damages that will take some time but can take place, but my hope is that we will consider repair and reparation to be normal things that are a part of what it means to be a people of God who are not afraid to look at any and every aspect of our history square in the face, name the good and augment it, name the evil and stop it and collectively repair the damage. Whether that's theologies that no longer serve us, whether it's theologies that were strategically created in order to prevent slave revolts, which Presbyterians produced a healthy amount of, or whether it's simply not understanding the full gifts that God has given to a wide range of people and recognizing that the Holy Spirit gives us new knowledge all the time, which means we have renewed opportunities all the time to get things wrong right and to make the future much better than anything in the past ever could have been.
Thank you for sharing that analogy. I think it's a great one. And it also reminds us that life continues, right? And that encounters continue even as we are in the process of repair. We don't take a break from living. We just simply go on to live and do this work as if it's not an exception, but very much a part of our discipleship and our calling. So I think that's a great reminder for us. And I hope you can also use that as you're talking with friends and loved ones and neighbors about why we should and can do this work and the beautiful sort of re-encounters that can happen. I love that phrase as well. When we do the work of repair, that we can in some ways begin anew and have a relationship that is healthy and whole and rooted in what we want it to be rooted in once we work with what went wrong in the past.
I can add one thing.
Yes.
To further answer your question, and thank you for it, there is an organization called First Repair in Evanston, Illinois. It's not far from here, but that organization was a part of helping Evanston, Illinois become the first municipality to establish reparations on a relatively small scale. And that organization is one of many that are working toward reparative justice activities locally. And so I think a practical way to move forward as a church is to just investigate what reparative activities are taking place near here and to see what role they might say a church could play in helping them speak to other churches in an effective way, or there may be something to learn from what happened in Evanston that would shed light on what might be possible here. And of course, since the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms receives, as all of our national agencies do, per capita from our congregations, it means we are always more than happy to do whatever it takes to be present with all of you, to answer your questions, to put our heads together and figure out what can be done, what might we try. How do we develop more theologically how this makes sense? How do we partner with other groups? So our agencies, and especially the Center for Repair in the Interim Unified Agency, is always eager to talk with individuals or ministries within the church or congregations or whoever would like to have conversation about how to be a part of repair. Even if it's just, I mean, there's no question too small, I'm telling you. Like I said this before, like, how do we persuade the clerk of session to take seriously that this is viable? Like, that's one of my favorite questions because that's a real question. Or if it's, oh, could you come and have a conversation with our Sunday school? Absolutely. Like, that's one of the coolest things to do. So there's nothing too small to call up the Center for Repair and say, hey, could you help us? Could you talk with us? Can you help us with this or answer a question?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your words today, your inspiration, your call, your challenge to us. And I want to thank everyone for joining us both here and online. I hope this was a fruitful morning for you. I know there is some food prepared, and so for those of you who are interested in staying for lunch with Reverend Jermaine, then I hope you'll stick around. There'll be some good food. We can continue this conversation. But again, want to thank you for giving the 2025 Galloway Lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.